Welcome to another episode of Tank Talks, your personal think tank for all things startups and venture capital. I'm your host, Matt Cohen, founder and managing partner at Ripple Ventures. On today's show, we are talking about how startups should think about managing their global payments in this new remote world with co-founder and CEO of Jeeves, Dileep Thazhmon. As everyone quickly realized over the last 16 months during the pandemic that remote work and distributed teams were here to stay, the unknowns of how to manage and pay for those resources were not as easy to understand. Startups were struggling with paying salaries to overseas employees and covering expenses in local currencies, and it was pretty easy to see how these problems could start to spiral out of control. On today's show, we asked Dileep what issues startups are facing today when dealing with global expenses on multiple payment rails, along with foreign exchange risk and payroll risk. We discuss how founders should think about independent contractors when setting up remote teams and when it makes sense to bring them on as full-time employees. Finally, we discuss how Jeeves is helping U.S. and non-U.S. entities get set up with lines of credit and corporate expense cards, in addition to earning amazing cashback rewards on expenses like AWS, Google, and Facebook. Now let's get into this week's episode with Dileep Thazhmon, CEO and co-founder of Jeeves. Thanks for joining us in the tank today, Dileep.
Thanks, Matt. Glad to be here, and thanks for having me on.
So as I mentioned, today I wanted to talk about managing global payments as a startup in this new remote world that founders are living in and operating, and how companies like Jeeves are helping solve this pain point. So as everyone knows, prior to the pandemic, it was becoming more common for tech companies to have employees and operations in more countries rather than their headquarters. However, post-pandemic, it's become almost guaranteed to have that set up. The benefits of distributed workforces are obvious, with access to talent, direct access to customers and partners in more markets are way faster. However, the need for startups to have multiple bank accounts wasn't always necessary. And if you were a US-based startup, you probably only had one bank account for businesses and used one credit card for all your payments, or maybe e-transfers. However, with more startups hiring around the globe, the need for global payments and expense management solutions has intensified, which is why you probably started Jeeves. So I'd love to kick things off for you to give us some insights on what the market looked like prior to COVID in your eyes, and what opportunities your team saw arise during the pandemic.
Sure. So again, thanks for having me on. So before COVID, a company that was based in a single country tended to stay in that single country. I think what COVID has accelerated is this push or the shift towards every company being global in some nature. People are a lot more okay with having remote workers. There's also a lot more flattening in terms of kind of the vendors people use. So today, a company will have a vendor that's based in Mexico, or an employee that's based in Canada, and could still be a US-based company. So what's really changed is really the nature of how people look at remote work, whereas previously that might have been just a smaller subset of the population. Now it's widely accepted. We have built Jeeves with the intention that if you were a company internationally, today to build out your expense management stack, you needed to have multiple vendors. You need someone for card, you needed someone for local rails, you needed someone for cross-border payments. And then if you were a growing company, in Mexico, for instance, your next stop would be Colombia, Brazil, and then you'd have to replicate that entire stack again. And so the idea was, if you were building this from scratch, you would try to build a single vendor that can handle all your payments out. And then when you expand as a company, or if you have employees outside that core home geographical region, you wouldn't have to change your stack again. So that was the driver. It wasn't built specifically for the COVID environment, but the COVID environment has definitely accelerated the usage that we've seen on Jeeves.
So when you talk about sort of moving from one spot to another and hiring people in those local markets, a lot of people think about that as, okay, I'm going to take a bit of a leap of faith and try to, pay some independent contractors or some people to just sniff out the market for us. Are you saying that COVID put people on the ground faster to actually go out and build out teams there, and therefore it required them to have a more robust infrastructure stack? Because, independent contractors have been around for a while, but with COVID, it sounds like people were more willing to take a larger bet and set up the proper infrastructure right away, but that was not available.
That's right. I think it's two things. So one, just because of some of the restrictions from COVID, people were not necessarily in their home country, right? You could have been in the UK and you could still be working for a US company or a Canadian company. And guess what? Now you're in the UK for 3 months or 4 months or 6 months, and you still have to be, able to get your work done, so to speak, right? So it really accelerated that component. And then the second part, it was a complete disconnect between where you had to be situated to live and where you had to be situated to work. And so this has gone from cities like, New York, where I used to live, or Florida, where I'm from, all the way to San Francisco, and also from like tier one, tier two, tier three cities, all the way to kind of suburbia, right? So it's kind of accelerated that pace, which would have normally taken maybe 5 years or 10 years, and congested that into really a year. So it was there before, it just wasn't at the scale that we are at now, both in terms of employees, and also the other thing that I'm seeing much more common now is that there's a flattening in terms of like even the tech ecosystem, in terms of vendors they use, in terms of providers of services. You can use a company based in India or China or Korea or anywhere else and still be functioning in Canada or the US or Mexico or anywhere else. And so that disconnect has also happened over the last year, primarily because it's been accelerated by COVID.
Right. It's kind of like people were using Upwork to do certain one-off projects and things like that, but Upwork took care of all of that. But when you're building a larger tech company and you have remote workers everywhere, you can't just use Upwork for every vendor.
This is the key difference between using a card, for instance, that's issued in the US, in Mexico. It's fine if you're traveling, it's fine if it's a one-off situation, but if you actually have operations there, that's not the most economical way to do it, because you're paying a 1 to 2% tax when you swipe the card, because it denominates in USD instead of the local currency. Again, once in a while, totally fine. You're not going to redo your entire system to cover that. But if you have actual operations, if you have actual employees, it becomes a real issue. And what people then tend to do is use local cards. That's a personal card, for instance, or use cards from local banks that just didn't have the credit limit that these fast growing companies needed.
Yeah, I mean, we have portfolio companies like VoiceFlow who have people working for them in Paris, France, and people in Tokyo, Japan. But those are kind of one-off people working for them. And obviously, the first problem they figure out is, how do I pay in their local currency? Or how do I attach myself to the multiple payment rails that are issued in this country? But there are a ton of other issues that startups are facing today. What are other challenges you're seeing startups face?
So I break it into two boxes. The first box is, if you're a fast-growing company internationally, there's a complete mismatch between what you can get from local banks or local providers and what you need to grow. Right? We have hundreds of clients. We have multiple unicorns that use Jeeves, and these companies just could not get a local bank that could provide 500K of Facebook spend, that could provide $1 million on AWS. It just was a complete mismatch between how local banks would try to underwrite these kind of companies and the amount of spend they needed, right? So in Canada or in Mexico, for instance, if you go to a local bank and you raise $3 million, they'll be like, great, give me 4 years of your tax return, come back in 4 weeks, and here's a card with $4,000 on it. You can't even use that for Facebook spend, right? So there's this complete disconnect between what these companies need and what they're able to be provided by the local, infrastructure. The other part that's been really interesting is just the explosion in venture dollars for international international companies, right? It used to be a smaller subset compared to the US, but even in the last 12 months, I don't even think we really kind of estimated or knew it would be at this scale. Where, I remember last year when we were fundraising, the big question was like, how big is the market? I never get asked that anymore, because it's just so obvious that there's capital and venture dollars going outside the US to international markets, from Canada to Mexico to Europe to wherever else, right? And so that's the second part. And then the third part, outside of the credit, is the reconciliation. Even if you had two cards, one in Paris and one in Mexico, from two different banks, what you're missing is you don't have a real picture of what your cash position is until really 3 to 4 weeks after the last month closed, because they're in two completely separate currencies. And what you usually do is you'll get two completely separate statements from your bank, send it to your accounting team, and they reconcile it a few weeks after the previous month closed. So what we can do is we actually have a software layer that we built from scratch that does the reconciliation for you. So you can use that card in Europe, pay us back in euros. You can use our Jeeves card in Mexico, pay us back in pesos, and we can do that reconciliation of spend in the software layer and give you separate statements, which you just can't do today, because both the statements and the spend is in two completely different systems, currencies, countries that don't talk to each other.
That's really interesting. I was thinking in my head in terms of, like, let's say Sequoia invests in a Indian-based startup. They put, 50 million US dollars into the company's local bank in India, in Mumbai or whatever. And then that company has to start spending that money everywhere else in local currencies. Are they reporting everything in US dollars from all the different operations they have with all the different vendors. Like, how do you trace that back to what they took as their input of capital versus the output of where it's going all around the world?
Yeah, so the way our system is built, we can handle multiple regions, multiple currencies. So we wouldn't even need to really make that distinction of, hey, you have to move your funds to your local account. So Jeeves today has about 6 to 7 different entities and bank accounts in different countries. So we operate as local entities in each region, like fully local. You can pay us back in your local currency. You can pay us back on local rails. So EFT in Canada, you can send us payments in EFT. You don't have to wire us funds to a US account. So for us, we don't want to force that distinction of you have to move funds to another account to be able to use us. We can handle any of the above. You have a US account and an Indian subsidiary, you have a Delaware C Corp, and like an LTD company in India or in Canada, we can handle all of the above. So that's really kind of the layers that we're building in that you don't get with just a local player, because they're built just for that specific region. And this is a big distinction. Most fintechs are single country players. They are built for one single country, and they, are from day one, that's their main focus, which is great. What we're doing that's a little bit different is from day one, where like if you were building something globally that then worked in one country and then the next country, how would you architect that? And those are not the same thing. You kind of have to look at it a little bit differently with that second layer that's like an orchestration layer across these different regions to be able to do that. But we have done that. And that's why, just to answer the question, we can handle both cases. You can use us from directly an Indian account. You can use us from a US account tied to an Indian company, and we can handle both of those.
So can you give our audience what you mean by local fintechs that are just operating that way?
So, most fintechs tend to focus on a single country, right? It's hard enough building it for one country. Every country has its own regulations on financial, just data, financial funds flow, et cetera. And you have to kind of follow that for anything you want to launch in that region. So that is how most fintechs kind of handle, launching a certain product. What we were doing that's a little bit different is we looked at it as how would you build this locally, but then how would you plug that into a more of a global product? Right, so our local components, our local entities are fully local, fully compliant. And on top of that, we also have a global layer, which is what is really the distinction of what we can provide, where you can use the card across regions and not have to worry about, specific FX fees or where do I need to pay the card from, because we can handle multiple kind of sources of capital and multiple regions that you can use the cards across. And that's fairly unique to kind of what we're building, which is really this like multi-layered expense management product. Like in the future, if I was like looking at this, the way it should work is you should just have the ability to spin up Jeeves, and you can run anything that's an expense, anything that's taking cash out of your books on us. We can provide the underwriting, the capital, and also the payment rails to facilitate that across countries. So you don't have to then change it from Mexico to Colombia or from Canada to the US or from UK to, the European mainland. We can handle all of the above.
Interesting. I mean, if you were to go a little bit farther in the future, people would say this is what Bitcoin is for, or this is what stable coins like USDC or USDT are for. Do you ever think about what that means in terms of how it relates back to these multifaceted exchanges, like currency exchanges that you're having to deal with today, which may not necessarily be the case in a couple of years from now?
Yeah, so we don't currently accept any type of crypto, but it is something we kind of keep an eye on. We do have some investors on our cap table that also are funds tied to larger crypto companies as well, and some of our users also tend to be in that space as companies. So I personally am very bullish on it, but it's not something that we currently handle on the company level. And the main reason is the regulations are not uniform. It's very different from the US to Canada to Mexico. And building a global product, you kind of have to be compliant across regions. So that's something that we have kind of looked at and seen, like, hey, is this something we could maybe launch in Canada or like maybe launch in like a specific region, both in terms of giving rewards tied to crypto, but also potentially at some point being able to accept that even as a source of payment.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was just always curious to hear how people in the fintech world think about this democratization of, single payments across the world.
I think it's a great thing. I actually think even something like meme stocks. It's funny. It gets passed around a lot, and there are going to be kind of people that, like, so to speak, burn their fingers. But it really is a form of like people across different levels, genres, etc., are taking part in the stock market, like good or bad. That's moving it forward. So I'm a big fan. I think it's an evolution, one way or the other, and it really is improving access. And you need guardrails, and you are going to burn your hand, and that's normal, and people learn and grow. But it is kind of expanding the pool, which I think is a good thing in general, because that's really how you build wealth over time.
Yeah, you said it perfectly. It's an evolution. Like the first use case is not going to be the best use case, but as long as we have some people using it for different kinds of means, as we move forward and evolve to the proper use cases that we always needed it to be solving, that's progress for everyone. And I think that's a great thing for the entire world. You touched on one other thing that I want to talk about, which is the issues of international payroll risk, where a company might be doing business in another country without first registering with the local government because they have a temporary employee working on a special project in a new country, or a company maybe just trying to hire a worker who lives in a foreign country, but would be working entirely on assignments for, let's say, a US based company. What suggestions do you have for founders looking to hire globally when thinking about the HR and payroll risk?
So I will answer this from 2 points. One, what we provide, and then one, how I look at it, because we are also a company with 6 different offices and people internationally. So Jeeves does not handle the compliance for payroll. There are many, many big companies, great companies. I know some of them personally that provide that, and it's I think it's a great service. But the compliance regulation side of that, we don't handle that. It's not a place we play in. What we play in primarily is providing the payment rails. So we can provide the payment outs. If you want to pay someone, you can do that, but we're not going to provide the compliance coverage. There are specific companies that, that's their full-time job, and it is a complex thing to deal with. The second part, in terms of how companies look at it, I think what's really interesting, where we can really, provide some value, is we today have employees in 6 countries, and we have not filed an expense report since day one, because you can run it directly on Jeeves across regions. So you don't have to worry about that anymore, which is, oh, how do I handle different currencies? How do I handle different countries? You can provide folks with a Jeeves card. You can provide them with a virtual card. You can provide them with local payment rails. They can run all of their payments. Think of us as your expenser, right? We put up your expenses for 30 days, and then you pay us back one time and you're done. And you just download that, feed into your QuickBooks, start your next month. So either, whether it's a independent contractor or whether it is a full-time employee, a part-time employee, if they're using company spend, what they would normally do is put it on their own card or use their own cash, and then have to get reimbursed, sent to their bank account by the company. What we can do is we can provide that second layer where we handle all of that for you, and you just pay one bill, and there's no fees. So you just pay your actual spend at the end of the month, and then you're done, right? So we're built to handle that scenario where you have multiple employees, either part-time, contractor, or full-time, anywhere in the world. And we can provide that spend that can handle both different countries and currencies in one go. And like I said, we have yet to file an expense report, and I'm pretty sure our structure is probably more complex than most companies at this stage.
Okay. And that is with the Jeeves hat on. Let's take the Jeeves hat off for a second. How would you suggest founders think about hiring globally with the HR and payroll risk as an individual founder?
Yeah, so I think the way to kind of look at it is 2 things. One, what do you need to get going, right? So me, just giving a little bit of background. Before this, I started a company, PowerInbox. We grew that to about 60 people. We raised about 24 million. And when I left, we were doing about 35 million in revenue. And one thing I've learned, and this is my second go around, is, when you are scaling quickly as a company that's starting, you want to really solve for kind of your core competency. And that doesn't have to be the same thing forever, right? In the beginning, your core competency as a company can be product. It can be marketing 6 months later. A year later, it can be sales. And it should evolve over time as your company changes. So you can solve for each competency at that same time as your company is growing. And tying to that, I would say, personally, the biggest thing, whether it's part-time, full-time, contractor, is what can you do to get on the ground quickly? Because the biggest mistake I see a lot of companies doing is they try to wait for perfection, which is like this unicorn hire or this unicorn, outcome. And like, honestly, things change. Like, we've seen this in the last year, right? It just isn't the same a year from now, and nobody really knows. And it's really planning for a year, but like deploying very quickly and then iterating. It's the iteration cycle that I think separates really good companies from companies that don't evolve over time. It's like, how do you take feedback that's coming in and then change over time? And we, both in my last company and this company, we've done both. We have some functions that we outsource completely, and it's a way better usage of our time, because we get much more complete function than if we had like 4 people in-house. Doesn't mean we're not going to build that in 6 months or 8 months. It just means for now, that's a good structure for us, even if they're not full-time employees. And then some are core functions. We need to own it completely, compliance, risk, etc. That's us because that's core to our business, right? So no one else is touching that. So again, it's just that separation of like which function is important right now, and do you need to own that in-house? And more important than anything else is how do you actually just get out quickly and then iterate from like the feedback you're getting in terms of what you're launching or what the market is telling you.
I completely agree. I mean, speed versus perfection is what is going to make or break some companies in this, new environment where everyone is hiring remotely. Everyone has got a ton of money in their war chest trying to find people to work for them. And if you can get into a market, first or second, start to move, even if the people that, start out there are not the people that finish there for you, that's better than waiting to have the perfect structure to go into those new markets, which makes perfect sense and why you guys have been so successful going into many markets with Jeeves. But what about how founders should think about independent contractors when setting up their remote teams? Should international employees be independent contractors, or do you think it should be properly set up? And how do you guys see it at Jeeves?
I don't think there's one answer to that. I really don't. I don't think it's like you have to do X or Y. I think it really depends on the stage of the company and what you need. I keep going back to kind of what I was bringing up, which is what is your core function, right? Your core function, you should own it. So the answer would probably be not independent contractors, but full-time employees. Your non-core functions, just do it as quickly as possible with the best talent you can find, whether that's independent or you might be lucky and like find someone that you can bring in-house. Fantastic. But that's how I kind of break that kind of subset, which is what is core to your company's success? You should own that. That should be in-house. If it's not completely core and you can scale much quicker with an independent contractor or even a agency or a team, you should absolutely do that. I mean, that's how I look at it. But every founder is different. And I also don't think there's a one answer to like, a lot of like how companies get successful. People look back and think that's the only path, but it really isn't. There's so many different ways to kind of get to that endpoint if you're evolving quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because, if you're an early stage company and you're trying to move fast and you don't have the infrastructure set up to hire full employees, so you go the independent route, or maybe you go the agency route for certain types of projects or work you need to be done. But I've even had experience with our own portfolio companies dealing with offshore teams with companies like Shopify for their customer success and developer onboarding tools, which was a complete disaster. And I would think such an important part of their developer ecosystem that they would want somebody who's a full-time internally trained employee dealing with it would be pivotal for a company at that stage. But then, you're right. It depends on how important they think that function is to their overall business.
The one thing that is kind of overarching there is if you do truly have a remote, either international team or agency, you kind of like your trade-off is that you need to have more oversight. Because that's really your trade-off for the fact that you don't have someone full house. You need to be involved, much, much more quickly and much, much more in depth than you might normally be if someone was full-time kind of working because you know them or you have a trust level there. So, it's much more transactional. It changes over time as you know them, they know you, there's a trust that builds. But in the beginning, I would say for success, it's one of those things where you really should overcorrect for how much oversight you're providing, either in terms of setting good requirements or in terms of kind of seeing milestones towards like an outcome, or in terms of like even owning a KPI for like an external, agency provider or independent contractor.
That makes sense. Let's say a company, though, has operations in several countries, like you guys do at Jeeves, that have different software costs. Let's say AWS cost. How should founders think about expenses and covering third-party cost for remote teams, and how should they manage those?
We're going through this right now, so it's something that's kind of evolving. I really, really do think in the beginning you should be solving a little bit more for speed than cost, right? Because if you really find product market fit, which is your goal in a seed or Series A company, a lot of the other things will come. But you can solve for like the perfect economics, but you have no product market fit. That's fantastic. Nothing's ever going to take off, right? So it's really like the way I look at launches or even a product or even building a company is how do you reduce variables, right? Like again, like what is it that you really need to control for an outcome, right? For a Series A seed company, it's product market fit. Product market fit is a function of really its growth, right? Because that means like people are using your product and that's why you have some fit in the market, right? So even if your economics are not completely where you want it to be, over time, which is when you start tightening it for the B, the C, etc. Really in the beginning, that's how I look at it. And so to kind of answer your question in terms of third-party services, It's again what can get you to launch and get you to testing out as quickly as possible. And if you have to pay a little bit more for that in the beginning, and you're able to, like, I think you should absolutely do that. Like when we started, it was bootstrapped, right? So, we had a very different cost structure when we were looking at bringing a third party in. Obviously, after we did our seed, a Series A, it's a little different. Now, the time value of that cycle to figure out the perfect partner is a little different than it was, like a year ago when we didn't have that, right? So it is a balance. There isn't a single answer to that, but I would solve really for like how quickly can you get to product market fit and what variables can you take off of your plate. So you're just focusing on the absolute distilled core of what it is that you're trying to build out, and that you should own in-house or have people that work on it in-house.
So let's just say you're a B2B SaaS company selling to enterprises, and you set up an office or a small team in the European region, in the UK or something, and all the customers there require you to have local AWS servers. And the sales team is saying, look, we cannot move forward until we have a new server spun up here on the European side. How should a founder think about that cost before they've even seen any contracts move forward or whatever, so that they can get potential deals to go through the funnel because they've got a team out there selling about it? And does Jeeves help with those types of things?
So we don't deal specifically with those types of scenarios. Like our mandate is simple. Like we don't deal with like the what you should do. What we deal with is like, if you need to do it, we can do that for you, right? So you make that decision. We don't tell you what to do. But most companies that are growing, need to have access to capital, one form or the other, whether it's a card, local rails, cross-border. Those are the three areas we cover right now. And we can provide the capital and we can provide the rails for you to use it. But your choice of what to do sits a little bit more on your side than it does on our side, because it's not our position to tell you, well, whether you should do one thing or the other. That's like that. I don't see our role as being that. Now, how I would look at something like that just personally is really what's the value of spinning that up, right? If that gets you a big contract, and again, there's no absolutes, right? It's an expected value, right? If you add that, is it going to increase your chance of success, chance of getting a big contract? Then it makes sense. If it doesn't, then it doesn't either. The other thing to think about is like a lot of times, a lot of the larger players like AWS, they are very startup friendly because they want you to build with them over time. So we have done structures and contracts with some vendors where it's like, hey, let's do a pay as you go kind of type model. And then as we evolve, as we get bigger, like we're happy to sign a year contract or like lock us in, etc. But in the beginning, it's really like, how do we test out what we need? And then also provide kind of the minimum structure and the minimum kind of support that we need to actually get this product live. And if you need that in this example, for a server in Europe, then you probably need to do that if that's core to your business.
No, I appreciate you sharing that personal advice. I understand Jeeves will not be telling companies how to operate, individually, but to hear it from your mouth on how you think about it personally is very helpful. So startups that are operating internationally, as you mentioned, are usually using a US dollar charge card and pay that standard 1% to 2% transaction fee that's charged by Visa or MasterCard, plus any of the exchange fees. How much are companies actually losing on these charges annually? And why hasn't there been a solution created for startups dealing with this until now?
The first one is fairly straightforward. If you use a USD card, basically it denominates in USD. So usually the rails, Visa or MasterCard, add a 1% to 2% charge. It isn't even the card provider. It just is the way it is, right? So again, it's fine for one-off trips. You're going to visit some, a beach somewhere, totally fine. If you have a business on the beach somewhere, you probably need a different card because you're going to lose a lot of money over time. The second part is, if you look at most banks, their structure is driven by fees, right? That's how they generate their revenue, right? So they are incentivized to have fees. They're incentivized to charge for a lot of different things. They're actually incentivized to not provide the best customer service because it keeps you using the product even longer because you don't have anywhere else to go. So we, don't charge any fees for the card's usage. Even in Canada, which is our second largest market right now, there's no fees to use a card, and we can provide limits that are, let's say 3-4x higher than like a local bank provider could provide for you, right? So for us, and me specifically, when I kind of look at like how you should be using the card and like what the comparison point is with a bank, it really is, what are you getting today and how much of that meets your need? And most of the times, most of the companies I've talked to, they do one of two things. They either use a local card in their own name, so it's a personal card where the liability sits directly with you, which is not great. Or if you're large enough, you might get a single, 1, 2, or 3 kind of bank cards, maybe an Amex, but then everybody shares that number, right? And think about the security there, right? Everybody has access to one number. that they can use. What happens if they leave the company? They have access to the same card, right? So Jeeves provides that security structure where you can create virtual cards on the fly, you can delete cards, you can inactivate them. It's how you should be kind of using a financial card type stack. Now, to answer the second part of your question, it's not that it wasn't done before, it just wasn't done at a global level. And I keep coming back to like that second layer. Like Jeeves is really two products. It's almost like a banking as a service platform that we own. And then on top of that, we have our own app. So it's a platform that's only used by the Jeeves app. That's the best way to kind of think about, what the Jeeves product is. And so because we have that second layer, that is what kind of separates what we're providing from a lot of providers. Most providers in a single region connect to the local bank or the local entity, get that statement and provide that to you. We actually have an abstraction layer where we generate our own statements, for instance, and that becomes the source of truth, right? So it's not that you can't do it, it's just that you need to rethink the model of how to do it. Because if you're building a company that provides a single card in a single country, you don't need to do what we did. In fact, it's probably more work to do what we did. But if you're trying to build something that's global, you kind of have to build that second layer, because without that, you don't get the global component where it can work across regions. So I know it's a little bit of a roundabout. I hope I was able to kind of answer that question.
No, that's great. And I mean, I agree. Yeah, it's probably not been solved to the extent that you guys have gone after solving it, which is awesome. And I've also read on your platform that you are helping not just US entities, but also non US entities. So for our Canadian listeners, which we have a ton of them because we're based in Canada as Ripple, how can they benefit from working with Jeeves?
Yeah, no, Canada, like I was saying, is our second largest market. We have our team on the ground there, including William, our GM. A couple of things. One, we can sign up both US and non-US entities. So if you don't have a US entity, not an issue. We can completely sign you up. Two, you can pay us again in your local currency, so CAD, Canadian dollars, and you can pay us using local rails, so EFT. E-transfer completely works. You can send us cash to that. And then three, one, we do cashback, which is 1% to 2%. And then two, our limits are going to be a lot higher than what you'd see from a local bank card that you might have. And then the last thing, honestly, like I'm happy to put folks in touch with existing clients. You can see how much easier it is to use it. You have an app, you have control to all your cards, you can delete cards, you can inactivate or activate a card on the fly, you can set limits. We're building in the ability to do e-transfer directly in the app. And all of that stuff, just to be very clear, you don't have to do any deposits. We provide the cash for you for 30 days. And then at the end of 30 days, you pay us back. So you don't have to transfer a single Canadian dollar to get started with Jeeves. And we have folks in Canada using us for 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 Canadian dollars a month to fuel their growth, to fuel their e-commerce. And if you think about some of the providers in the market that might provide Facebook spend, for instance, but then charge you 6% or 8%, with Jeeves there's no charge, it's zero. You can literally use it. There's no fees. The way we make our money is off the interchange, right? So you don't charge you a single cent. You can use the card. You don't have to pay a 6%, 10%, whatever it is. Use it for your Facebook spend. And by the way, SaaS spend is our largest spend category. So, we're completely comfortable with that and we can handle that across the board. But yeah, we'd love to have any Canadian companies that are even remotely interested. It's tryjeeves.com, or you can send me an email, dileep@tryjeeves.com.
That's amazing. I mean, I think I'd even sign up for it as a venture fund, but I think a lot of our portfolio companies could definitely benefit from that because, as many people know here in Canada, we've been lacking on a lot of innovation on the open banking side, and some of the banks are trying to catch up. But that sounds like a great solution for a lot of our startups. So you recently emerged from stealth with 100 million in debt and 31 million in equity funding led by A16Z, of which 5 million was from a seed round closed last year, after you completed that YC summer batch in 2020. Can you tell us how the round came together and why you decided to take on that 100 million of debt with the equity as well?
We had raised about 5 million in October of last year. So we were pretty well capitalized. So we weren't necessarily looking to do the A. But for me, really, it came down to, was it a fund and a partner we would have picked eventually for an A? And Andreessen Horowitz, was one of our top choices there. And it's also kind of getting along with the partner, right? This is my second time doing this. I think a big part of like investing, especially the first, second rounds, is you're picking a long-term partner. So if you have the luxury, pick well, because it'll come back, good or bad, it's going to come back to you, right? So that's one thing that we were thinking through. And to be honest, like Andreessen Horowitz was a good partner. They wanted to really kind of make sure they were part of Jeeves. And it happened very quickly. It happened in about a week. And then once we completed that, really what we were focused on is completing our deadline. because we wanted to have access to capital for growth, right? So when a company starts, especially a company that's capital intensive like we are, you do that off your equity, right? But that equity is the most expensive capital. So as soon as you can, and whenever you can, you want to try to move that to a debt sheet. And I think it's a credit to both our team, my co-founder Shervin, whose background is on the debt side, and also kind of the product that we have, that we were able to line that up going into the A. Most companies line it up going into the B, and especially at the amount that we were able to kind of get lined up. And for us, the number one reason to do that is because we're growing. We've grown about 5x since we did the term sheet for the A. So we've grown substantially since even that 3-month point 3 months ago. So for us, it's one of those things where we had to do a deadline as soon as possible, and we were able to find a great partner that was able to provide that, and that's fueling a lot of the growth that we're seeing now as well.
That's amazing. I mean, I talk about this with a lot of companies of ours that are at that sort of A, B stage where they're like, well, we just raised 10, 25 million of equity. Let's go out and get some venture debt. And I was like, only take the debt if you can buy revenue or get more revenue at a cheaper cost of capital than what the equity is. And in your case is the perfect example of that. You have the equity, which you need to build the business, but you don't want to use that to continue operating the working capital you need to fund the 30-day credit for all the customers using your services. But when you get that $100 million debt facility, that cost of capital goes way down and it makes perfect sense. But would you agree that for traditional SaaS startups, taking on additional debt on top of the equity should only be applied if your cost of capital can be used to acquire more revenue?
I think in theory that's correct. I mean, you should look at capital sources as basically what are you going to do with the capital, because nothing is free. Equity is also not free, right? Everybody's getting paid one way or the other, including investors. They're taking a portion, right? So, and there's a cost of capital, however you want to call it. You're paying for it one way or the other, and the question is, what are you getting on the other side? And for us, to your point, it was a very easy, clear calculation of like what that cost was versus what it can fuel in terms of what we take back in as revenue, and also the growth that it can sustain versus needing to do that off of like an equity chunk instead.
Right. That makes sense. You said that you're live with more than 100 companies, including a large YC contingent. I'm sure that's way more now. And there's a huge pent up demand of a wait list of over 5,000 companies. So what can we expect to see from you and the team the rest of the year in terms of new markets and new product offerings?
We have, it's a couple of things, right? For me, Canada is a market that we haven't spent as much time on. And so really our focus in the next few months really is to start building out our presence in Canada. So that's a big focus for us. We're going to be launching additional geos internationally as well. So that's going to happen in the next month or two, not at full liberty to disclose which ones, but there are a few coming down the pipeline. And then we're expanding the product line. Like we're building full cross-border support through partner. We're also adding the ability to do kind of advanced products like working capital lines, et cetera, both in Canada and also in other markets. So really, I see this as not even day one. It's literally day zero. We kind of proved a concept and it has a lot of demand, but like the product is maybe 20% of what we would want this to be at a state where we're like, hey, this is Jeeves, right? Jeeves is a multi-faceted financial product where we take care of everything for you, including the capital, the underwriting, and also the payment rails. So corporate card is kind of the easy opener, but we're not really looking to build a corporate card product. We want to provide that as one of the things, but really it's all of the rails you need as a fast-growing company. So you don't have to think about that. You just spin up Jeeves and we handle anything that's a spend out. You pay us in your local currency. There are no fees. Just worry about the other things you need to worry about, because there are plenty of those, and this shouldn't be one of those things that you need to care about.
That's awesome. And we'd love to be your Canadian partner and help you get out to more of the Canadian ecosystem. So we'll definitely be following up with you after the show. But before we wrap things up, we always love to ask our guests for their fast favorites, where I list off 5 categories and you name your favorite for each one of them. So first one is your favorite podcast.
I listen to The Daily, actually, like not daily, but pretty close to daily. And I like it. It's 15 minutes. It covers things I need for the day. I'm a little bit of a news hound. So, that's kind of my go-to there.
That's a good one. Favorite news or blog, newsletter or blog?
I actually read I'm a big American football fan. So I read the Pro Football Talk on, I think it's NBC Sports by Peter King, pretty much once a week. And I'm a huge Philadelphia Eagles fan. So it, keeps me going in the off season. So that's probably up there.
Nice. Favorite tech gadget?
So I love music, and I feel like if anyone launches a new speaker, I somehow find a way to get it, especially if it's portable. So there's a point where speaker fidelity starts losing value, but I'm pretty sure not there yet. So yeah, probably portable speakers. It's just one of those things that I, for some reason, have a lot of.
Yeah, I feel the same way. My wife keeps telling me we got to get rid of them. There are just too many of them sitting around the house, and they're all connected and they're all playing at the same time. Favorite new trend?
I think I touched on this before, but I'm actually pretty okay with the whole meme stocks thing. I think it's great. I think it actually opens up a whole market. I think, people always get threatened when existing systems change. And then they're like, oh yeah, no, totally. I knew that was happening and I love change. But in the beginning, it's always like, well, should they be doing it or should they again, I don't know what the answer is. I just think it's moving it forward. It's an evolution. And I think that's a good thing because if you think about it, meme stocks are really an indicator. They're a leading indicator. They're showing you where some segment of the market wants to put their money. So you can either say that it doesn't exist or you can think about what you can do with it. But, I think it's a good long-term trend that more segments of the population are getting involved with wealth and investing, whether it's meme stocks or something else.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it on the Future of Finance podcast with Boris Wertz from version 1, and he was saying how meme stocks are really helping people to see what has traditionally been impossible to analyze, which is, market sentiment towards a company or a brand or some type of idea. And they get behind that with, thousands and thousands of followers. And that's typically not something you're seeing show up in, consumer transaction data or something like that. So I totally agree.
I think it's a fascinating, I don't want to say subset, but it's just a fascinating combination of so many things like psychology, investing, community, technology. So it's just like this, zeitgeist that has everything going in one. So I'm a big fan. Again, I don't know where it's going to end. I'm not saying one way or the other on that. I just think opening up the pool for more people to invest is a good thing long term.
Absolutely. I think it throws the boomers for a tailspin though every time it happens. And last but not least, a favorite book.
So I read a book called The Undercover Economist by Tim Harford a few years ago, and it's just a really fascinating book about how just random things in life have some kind of a pattern to it. So highly recommended. Why are there so many Starbucks, and why are all the grocery stores right next to each other? They should in theory be far apart because they're going after different parts of the market. But it just has a very interesting take on some of these things that I don't know, maybe I just see and think about, but also just sometimes you're just why are there so many Starbucks? But it's one of those books that I found really interesting and kind of just provide a different perspective on some of these things that you see daily.
I like that one. Sounds very interesting. Thanks for sharing that. And thanks for joining us in the tank today to discuss managing global payments as a startup in this new remote world with Dileep Thazhmon from Jeeves.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Matt. Appreciate it. And thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Tank Talks. To learn more about this episode, be sure to go to Apple Podcast or Spotify to find more detailed notes on this episode or to check out previous episodes. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review and a rating as it helps us out a lot. And hit that subscribe button so you can get notified when new episodes come out. Finally, make sure to give me a follow on Twitter @MattyBCohen or @Tank Talk Podcast to stay up to date on new episodes or to be a guest on our show. Till next time,